Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. As hate crimes rise across the world, what role can educational institutions play in fighting against these ideas of hate? It's a conversation with many perspectives, mainly because schools and universities are not just critical places to unlearn stereotypes and negative perceptions, but in fact, sometimes these very institutions reproduce inequalities and prejudices. So let's dive deep into the conversation and talk to experts today. Joining us for this conversation is Professor Nathan Jones, who's an associate professor of English at Skyline College. He's also the author of several books, including Black Man in Europe and Excerpts from My Soul. He joins us from Oakland. Thank you so much, Professor Nathan Jones, for joining us, and welcome to the show. A very warm welcome to the show. Now, before I put my first question to you, I want to just read out some facts and figures. Islamophobia, as recorded by the Foundation for Political, Economic, and Social Research, has been on the rise all across Europe. In the United States in 2018, this is FBI's data, hate crimes were the highest they have been in 16 years. In Asia, all across South Asia, minority rights, especially for religious minorities, are on the decline. Now, given this political atmosphere, this climate that we're living in, this truly global climate of hate, how do you think that's impacting educational institutions?
Well, I think it has always impacted institutional education. It's really nothing new. Since, like American educational institutions have been invented, there's been a system of anti-Blackness from the beginning. And you can look at policies, practices, procedures, conversations, textbooks over time. Many of those things have always factored into creating an embedded system of hate towards, people of color, but specifically African Americans. And so I think when we look at it from a historical point of view, we need to really understand that there's always been a concerted effort to put people of color, and specifically African Americans, at the bottom of the totem pole. There's always been this notion, that we have been less than, or that we were never really considered to be human, and we never really have been really in the conversation of progression or change or civil rights in this country. There have been many attempts to change the trajectory of how we are seen in the educational world, or how we're seen in professional spaces, or how we're seen in many spaces. But it goes back to a very basic, simple system of systemic racism, cultural and structural discrimination that has always been pervasive in our country. And those things have not changed. I think what we're seeing right now is just a manifestation of those things that have always been there. But it just took maybe one incident like the George Floyd situation, which is really a tapestry of many things that have been happening over a long period of time, to be a catalyst to see what America is really like, and to see how we've been experiencing these hate crimes or white supremacy or racist strategies and tactics for a long time in our society. So nothing has really changed. It's just, again, just a manifestation of things that have already been bubbling under the surface for a while.
Right. Now, given, as you're saying, these biases, these stereotypes, the violence against racial minorities, against many different groups, it's always been there, but now it's just become more evident. Given all of this, when we talk about the role that educational institutions have played, especially universities and colleges, do you see those as places for resistance, or are those places where you feel those same inequalities have been reproduced?
Yes, the same policies have been reproduced, but you have now an opportunity. I like to look at this as an opportunity. So, for instance, where I am, we've just started a gallery in our library where we've created, and some of the people came to me to ask me to create like a gallery of anti-racist books and curriculum to really start to talk about the issues that are going on in our universities and colleges. But I've been a part of a team or group of individuals who have always been fighting against racist policies and strategies and, procedures for a long time. And even in the curriculum that I teach, whether I'm teaching books on white fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo, or books by Dr. Joy DeGruy, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, or The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Many of these books have been a part of my curriculum. Mm-hmm. And so what we try to do is implement and try to, use educational strategies, through literature, through research texts and things like that, to get students exposed to having an opportunity to get an understanding about how systemic racism works in our culture, in our systems, in our school systems. But you've always had a group of individuals, ones who fly under the radar or ones who are very well known in institutions across the United States to talk about, racism and systemic issues that are happening.
Professor Nathan Jones, let me just step into that point there that you're making, that there's always been a group of individuals who have tried to resist against these systems of oppression. That point in itself, do you think the onus of doing that is always on those groups that are being oppressed? You also being a professor of color and trying to bring out that literature, trying to bring out that history. Is it an unfair burden on you alone?
Of course. I always tell individuals who I talk to, white, black, or otherwise, I say it is not our responsibility to try to fix a system that is broken. It's our responsibility to sit at the table as the system is trying to be corrected. If we didn't create the problem, why should we be the ones to fix the problem? But we understand that because where we are and who we are, and because we want to see change, it's like if someone is in your house, and they're an invited guest in your house, and your house may be unkept, it may be dirty or whatever. Let's use that as a metaphor. And they see something that needs to change, or they see something that needs to be corrected. They might say, well, you know what? Let's see what I can do to correct the situation. Let me bring some light to it. Let me help a little bit. But I think the problem is that, we live in a country that has always been in denial of the wrongs that it has been creating. Mm-hmm. And it has always looked at its people of color, its black people, its brown people, to be those individuals, to be the ones that is going to champion the cause of having change to happen in this country. And like I said previously, it's not our responsibility, but it becomes our responsibility because we want to see the change happen. And we know the people that have created the issues in this country are not going to be the ones to fix it, when in fact, they should be the ones that fix it.
Right, those are very, very powerful points you make there. Another question that comes up is, you are a college professor, and this wanting to help students unlearn certain things, unlearn certain stereotypes, it seems to start quite later on into their academic lives, into their academic careers. How much earlier do you think this should begin, and how do you think schools can do that?
I think that first it begins at home. I think it's the parents. The parents need to be educated. And then as the parents are being educated, that should trickle down to their children. But it should start as early as grammar school, K through 12, really K through 6th and 7th through 12th grade. I think students need to be exposed to understanding what racism is and systemic racism is, and then being taught how to navigate it and how to understand how it can impact them in their lives in multiple ways and on multiple levels. And again, it starts with babies. Babies don't know any different until you teach them different, right?
Right.
Babies are very beautiful individuals until they get exposed to racism, or they get exposed to white supremacy, or they get exposed to people who try to treat them differently based on maybe skin color, maybe based on their eye differences or their hair texture or whatever like that. And that begins to the understanding that there may be a difference in terms of how they are. So it's taught. And then there's just certain things that are already systemically happening that they pick up on at an early age. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be important that parents and teachers are educated at an early start, even in their careers, to start thinking about how they can be a part of the system of change in our educational system. And that's across the board, from teachers to administrators to faculty members to grounds workers, whomever might be in an institution or educational facility or environment. Everyone needs to be trained on the issues of systemic racism and structural discrimination that exist in our educational systems. So it started at an early age.
It does start at an early age. And stay with that point, Professor Jones. I also want to introduce Dr. Rashawn Ray, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Maryland and a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Good to have you, Dr. Ray, with us again, and a very warm welcome to the show. Now, as Professor Jones rightly stated, it begins at a very very early age. And talking about schooling, just when a kid enters school, it's probably the first experience of secondary socialization that they have. And when they start facing and when they start hearing different ways of how they should judge different groups of people, how do those things impact their development and their perceptions?
As early as 4 years of age, kids start to be implanted with race. This isn't something that's genetic or biological, it's socialized. So what people have to realize is if we actually don't combat the prejudicial and discriminatory ways that society imprints our children, then they will grow up in a society thinking in prejudicial ways. Education has a critical role to play, in particular with painting an accurate portrait of history. In the United States, there are a lot of schools and a lot of school systems that actually do not even teach that Black people in the United States were enslaved. They talk about them as if we were indentured servants or voluntarily participated in these processes. So history becomes extremely important. The second thing that's important is to approach things in an evidence-based way. Kids can retain information in ways that oftentimes adults don't think that they can. And we have to realize that that's important. And the reason why that's important is part of the socialization process that kids get out of school is highlighting oftentimes a racially segregated society. Neighborhoods and schools are more segregated today than they were in 1980. And education has to play a role in helping to rectify that, primarily through a truth and reconciliation process.
Right. I want to pick up on that point about teaching history the right way and teaching history in a way that it includes all sorts of narratives and it is a representation of actually what happened. Being critical to your own history, how important is that? And how difficult is that for schools to integrate this practice?
You know, I think it's critically important. I mean, I would argue that it's one of the most important things in higher education and in elementary school. All disciplines have a role to play, from the humanities and English and literature to the arts to obviously thinking about the social sciences. I think one thing that's lacking in schools is that while we have social studies, which is supposed to teach us history, oftentimes social science is lacking in that space to help people interpret and contextualize what's going on. A truth and reconciliation process in thinking about history is one of the best ways to teach people about the past so that the future isn't repeated. And on college campuses in particular, when students get there, what needs to happen is there need to be mandatory courses on racial history, which some universities are already moving towards. There need to be certificates that lead people toward truth and reconciliation and engaging in anti-Black racism and also anti-racism more broadly. And it needs to be an acknowledgement of how racism impacted the universities in which they're going to. I know the University of Maryland is going through this now. Our new president, President Pines, is really forward thinking in these areas. And I think what we have to do is have a historical reflection. Universities can also have a racial history tour. In fact, public schools and private schools in local areas can do this as well. They can take kids on field trips in their community to experience what's happening there so that people have a better understanding of what's happening, because educational spaces are some of the only places where social interactions can happen that oftentimes do not happen anywhere else, where you can get kids and young adults together of different races to have conversations with one another.
Right. Dr. Rashawn Ray, tell me this. One question that pops up into my head, and I want to take this to Professor Nathan Jones and ask him this. When we're talking about universities and college spaces and helping students become exposed to various kinds of literature, these students aren't passive. These aren't just young children. These are grown, many times adults who are dealing with this material. Do you face a resistance or pushback in trying to present those narratives that contradict and sometimes go against so much of what they already know?
Yes, it all depends. I think it all depends on where the students are coming from personally. You do have some students who've been fortunate to be exposed to great teachers in their high school environments. But I think when students are young and they're impressionable, and especially here in the Bay Area is kind of a different bubble than most places in the United States, being from Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area, Berkeley area. People tend to be a little bit more conscious about race and about politics and about anti-Blackness, about inclusion and diversity. So there are some students who come equipped with some information. And I think because of the climate that we're in now, students are very hungry and thirsty for change, and they want to see a difference in terms of the education. A lot of students come ready to learn about, like African literature or Asian literature or, Latinx literature, things like that, because a lot of times, like you said, they're not exposed to those things at home. And like Dr. Rashawn said, it's about, changing the way we see the institution, reimagining how we teach, reimagining the literature, reimagining the books that we use. And like I said, in my classes, I do all of those things. And one of the things I think, which we mentioned, this idea about acknowledging the past and revisiting history of anti-Blackness, looking at how we can authentically reconcile an institution's history and legacy of racism. We need to be able to identify a task force that can change and looked at conducting archival research and sharing its findings with the campus community. We need to search for letters, photography, yearbooks, journals, articles, consult with local historical societies, interview former students and leaders or educators, and share findings of the public, and look at how the campus can remove rituals, the symbols, and artifacts that express racism and anti-Blackness, such as statues and named buildings, donors, scholarships, mascots, and traditions, right? Renaming schools and after people who have helped to advance racism in any way. So we probably have to identify tangible and concrete ways to access or account for the history and the legacy of racism against Black folks, right? So there's a lot of things that we have to do, and it takes a full task force of individuals working collectively together to have a change, right? And like you said, that's not only just English instructors or math instructors or science or history instructors, that's the whole institution, and that starts from the top to the bottom. And we have to work, again, collectively to make those change and to make the impact on our community and our students.
Right. Professor Rashawn Ray, as we're talking about how institutions can have a racist legacy, or how, institutional change is needed, I do want to focus on the classroom as well, and how there can be subtle forms of reinforcing stereotypes, either through the dynamic, either through teacher-student interaction, either through other ways. Things that we are often not conscious about are things we don't discuss enough. But take us through it. How can that happen, and how can that lead to further marginalization of certain groups?
It's a great question. So oftentimes in the classroom, if we don't deconstruct and decolonize our syllabi, so the types of information that students receive, as well as who talks and communicates during class, we actually reproduce the same levels of systemic racism that exist outside of the classroom. So what we have to do is what Professor Jones was saying. We have to reimagine our classroom and transform it. I know I aim to do this. I teach large and small classes. I teach courses on race. I also know the Bay Area very well. I did my postdoc at UC Berkeley, and my kids were actually born in Oakland, California. And the East Coast and the middle of the country are different, as Professor Jones was also saying. So the approaches that professors and teachers have to take in, say, Indiana is different from what they might take in Maryland, Georgia, or California. The first big thing is what readings professors include on their syllabi. Are these readings coming from diverse scholars? There are subtle things that I do that integrate diversity into my class. I show pictures of the people who wrote those articles. They get to see them. They get to see the racial diversity of them. They get to see a white person who is talking about racial history, and then they get to see a Black person who's talking about social psychology. These are the sort of things that we have to integrate in, and then we have to purposely frame our discussions. I break students up into groups. I have them number off. They split up in the classroom. They have detailed discussions with people who they otherwise might not be having discussions with, and these sort of things can help to transform their thinking. And then most importantly, we talk about what do you do with it? Not just that you gain the information, but how do you make sure that you are being racially equitable and being what Ibrahim Kendi calls an anti-racist. And I give them tools to help them go throughout that process in their daily lives, regardless if they are majoring in business or in sociology.
Take us through some of those tools that you give them in order to recognize their own behavior and where they need to correct themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a few things that I do. The first big thing is I teach them that when it comes to race and racism, that it's perceived that race is real in its circumstances, meaning where it comes from, because it's real in its consequences, meaning the outcomes. We might talk about COVID-19, for example, and talk about the ways that the structure of our neighborhoods, I might show them a video of, say, St. Louis, and show them how highly segregated it is, and then talk about the lack of access to resources. I also help them get in their own minds. We use the implicit association test out of Harvard. I use them in my virtual reality lab with police officers as well. These are tests that help people to recognize what their biases are about a host of things: race, skin tone, thinking about age, thinking about weight, gender, and a host of things. And this allows people to take an inside look into what's going on. And I help them to realize that by recognizing your implicit biases, that's the way that you work to hold them in check. I also ask students why they think they have those biases. Right. And they're very transparent and inward looking. They say things like, well, when I think about it, I don't think I've ever had a black teacher before. Like, that's a big deal. And that applies across the board for race, not just white students, but black students as well. So part of it is helping them to get inside of their own minds and then informing them how to also conduct research. I say, don't just take a piece of information that you found on social media. These are objective outlets that you can refer to. Make sure you search one topic 3 times, get a base of information so that you have the knowledge moving forward. These tools help them throughout life to be able to manage the information they receive about race and racism.
Right. Dr. Ray, I'm pressed for time, but I want to out there, and I'm going to put this to you and Professor Jones as well. I want to show you a tweet by the Education Trust. Now, according to this tweet, black girls are more than 4 times more likely than white girls to be arrested at school. There is a disparity and a very clear exclusion of not only people of color, but also women. Now, this intersectional approach to trying to understand how we can make schools better, more inclusive, how can that be done? And take us through it from your lens, the work you do, and then I'm going to put the same question to Professor Jones and ask him how he thinks that's possible to do, take a more intersectional approach to things.
You just hit the nail on the head. We have to center race and gender, and its intersection as well with class and sexuality. I've been doing this for years. I published a special issue in Ethnic and Racial Studies, which is the top international race journal. I published that special issue with 2 graduate students at the time who are now professors. One is a black woman, one is an Asian woman. And what we did was we took information about the Black Lives Matter movement, and we highlighted the ways that women who are victims of police violence are less likely to be discussed, the way that black women who are leaders of the movement for Black lives are less likely to be listened to, less likely to be tweeted from. So by highlighting this information, we can start to see these disparities that, look, it's not simply about race, but it's also about the intersection with gender that oftentimes goes in divergent ways. And it's important for people to recognize that the experiences of black women are different from the experiences of their white counterparts.
Right. Professor Nathan Jones, when we're talking literature, when we're talking about books, when we're talking about readings, how important is representation here, not just of race, but of gender, of sexuality, of all different types of factors?
It's extremely important. For instance, like Dr. Ray is saying, for me, for instance, I teach Black Lit and critical thinking. And one of the things I try to always highlight in my Black literature class, I try to use Black women writers, Black women professors, Black women historians and educators as a focal point. For instance, like when I teach like an English 105 course, a critical thinking or composition course, I did a series where, I try to look at various subjects. For instance, we use Dr. Carol Anderson's White Rage. We use Dr. Joy DeGrew's Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And these are unit, breakouts, right? We also use Harriet Washington's, Medical Apartheid and books like that, which is focusing on brilliant African-American women in various fields of disciplines, right? And so students get exposed to these various high-profile individuals. So it's embedded. And if it's in a literature course, I put students into study groups like Dr. Ray does, right? And we name the actual study groups after Black women writers and poets like Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, Lucille Clifton, and things like that, right? So students can constantly be exposed to Black writers and Black poets, so they can get an understanding that these individuals have made major contributions to the literary canon in American society, that they've made major contributions to the African American community and to the world based on the work that they have done and are doing.
Right. They're such important points, and thank you so much, Professor Nathan Jones, for taking out the time and talking to us. Dr. Rashawn Ray for coming on and talking to us. Always a pleasure having you. Thank you for joining our conversation. We're going to go for a short break. Stay with us. When we come back, we talk about how consumer spending is expected to shift as lockdowns ease across the world. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, the pandemic has deeply impacted economies across the world, but as lockdowns ease, how is consumer spending expected to change? Let's discuss this further. Joining us for this conversation is Mr. Einar Tangen, who's a political and current affairs commentator. He joins us from Beijing. Thank you for being with us on the show today, Mr. Einar Tangen. Now, let's talk about China first and talk about the fact that this was the first country to be hit by the virus, massively so, and it's the first country to recover. Talking about this and talking about what's been happening with the economy so far, how has consumer spending changed after lockdowns eased?
Well, you had a kind of V-shaped spending recovery, but it's certainly not back to the way it was. I mean, it was down 1.8% in June and about 1.4% in July. So, I mean, 1.1% in July. So things still have a ways to go. But, you know, if you were here right now in Beijing and you looked around, the traffic is as bad as it's ever been in terms of being congested. People are out on the street. Today is Chinese Valentine's Day. And as a result, the restaurants are packed. People are out. They're not, only a few are wearing their masks. All the servers are wearing masks in any hospitality. But people seem to be getting back to some sort of normalcy. But a lot of that has been protected because they've been, 2019, there was actually a 9% increase in real disposable income. So, you know, even though disposable income went down by about 4%, the fact is it's been pretty well. Unfortunately, not for everybody. People who depend on service jobs, et cetera, they've been hard hit.
As you talk about returning to some sense of normalcy, I'm left to think about how prior to opening up economies and even China, we kept talking about there is going to be a need for a new normal. Do you see that happening in retail outlets, in services, in the services industry, in how shopping is happening?
Well, what's really amazing is I was talking to a lot of friends who run service businesses, accounting, and also law, and they said something that was quite interesting. One said that right now, only 10% of his lawyers are coming into the office, yet billable hours have gone up by 25%. This really calls into question how much commercial real estate is going to be attractive. There's quite a bit of it around. Obviously, if people start pulling back, those buildings have to be repurposed. And then also retail. You know, it's just been an astronomical rise in the amount of online buying, and people are getting increasingly comfortable with that, not having to go to the store. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, people aren't interested in experiencing things. But what seems to be happening is people go to the malls, they look at items, and then they just scan it or go home and order it over the internet. And practically by the time that they get home, the product is there.
Right. It does seem to be a shift in the way consumers are interacting with the whole shopping experience. Now, I just want to plug this in and talk about consumer demand and how we're supposed to see a change, especially for the domestic market within China. How much of the trade war is impacting any of this?
Well, it is. Obviously, the trade war in combination with COVID is had a real impact, especially on imports and exports. In terms of, the long term, the situation is demand worldwide is going to be down. It takes a while. Mm-hmm. And ironically, it's the developed nations who are going to feel it most sharply. If you have a country that's 70% necessity and 30%, choice items, luxury, entertainment, etc. You can decrease that amount, but the number of jobs dependent on that sector are quite small. But when you're talking about the U.S., it's 70% services, 30% is related to necessities. And in that kind of situation, you can have a very, very sharp drop-off. So world demand, it's anticipated, it will go down. It's not going to be this kind of sharp V that many politicians in the U.S. would hope it to be. It'll probably be a long, more drawn-out situation, as the U.S. Fed has indicated.
Right, and I want to dig a little deeper into the case of the United States and understand it a little more from the point of view that you're coming from. Having such a huge, enormous consumer market and seeing what's happening in terms of unemployment and seeing how there's so much antagonism between China and the United States in terms of trade, how do you think that's going to impact the overall economic landscape of the country?
Well, one of the things that everybody is kind of holding their breath is what's going to happen in this November election. It's quite clear that if Donald Trump is elected, that you'll still have this kind of great uncertainty, tremendous antagonism towards China, and perhaps even some sort of military skirmish. That would be obviously very bad for business. Everyone would be pulling in. However, if Biden is elected, while he will not take a charitable eye towards China and will be attacking it mostly on human rights grounds, it will take some time for him to kind of marshal this grand alliance of democratic countries that he wants to put together. And in the meantime, he's signaled quite clearly that he's not interested in this kind of economic tariff games. I think he will be pulling back from that. He might be trying to rejoin TPP. He'll certainly be supporting the WHO, probably the WTO. He might even reappoint judges so it becomes a functioning entity. If that happens, you're going to see a lot of economic activity, the kind that you want. Remember, everyone says that the global supply chain is bad, but the fact is it's efficient. It makes sure that there's more money in people's pockets. And this is a time when that's very, very important.
Right. Mr. Tangen, you give us a very, very packed answer there and so much to dig deep into, but we're going to have to save that for another time. Thank you so much for joining us and talking to us from Beijing. Now joining us is Maheen Ahmad, who's a digital marketing expert from Lahore, and Ibrahim Shaukat, who's the founder of Dari Mooch, which is beard care products. He joins us from Lahore as well. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ibrahim Shaukat, let me just jump to you first and tell me how during this time the way you have tried to sell your products has changed.
So I would say initially in the start, we had a few problems with logistics. It was getting very hard to sort of deliver the products. Plus, due to the lockdown, it was very hard to get sort of the operations team in the office, pack the orders and then send them. However, in terms of marketing and all, I would say it was good in terms of business since more and more customers were spending time on their phones. So we saw a decrease in ad cost. A lot of the big players who were reliant on operations weren't putting a lot of money on ads. So I'd say the last 3 months have been very, very good for us in terms of business. Ad costs have decreased, marketing costs have decreased, and we've sort of done the highest in terms of sales over the last 3 days.
Wow, that's remarkable to hear. And that really echoes our previous analyst's comments there that while we are seeing spending capacity shrink, we're also seeing more and more people spending time on the internet, diving into this in these consumer products, buying more. Maheen, when we're talking about all of this and talking about how consumers are spending more time on the internet than before, perhaps a record high, how has that changed the marketing strategies for products? Have you seen any noticeable shifts?
Yes, definitely. Saying that we're living in unprecedented times would be an understatement, to say the least. But I think that a lot of consumers are more interested in knowing the safety procedures a brand is taking. So now they have to not only focus on the packaging and the rest of the marketing techniques, but they also have to make sure that the consumers know the kind of safety procedures that the product goes through. And then there is also a shift towards contactless delivery. A lot of people want to know how the product will be delivered. Will they have to contact the delivery person? And will he be wearing a mask? Will he be sanitizing the products. So like, I think that a lot of marketing revolves around telling the consumers that these are the kind of steps that are being taken by a brand to establish a secure and like corona-free procedure as per se.
Right, trying to maintain those SOP that all businesses are supposed to follow, but also talking about the competition, how it's intensified online with more and more sellers advertising their products on the internet, because that is now and was for a long time, as long as the lockdown lasted, the only way to sell their products. With that competition, how can companies perhaps have a more unique marketing strategy?
I think that from a marketing strategy standpoint, I think that it is very, very essential that whatever the company is selling, they know the kind of target audience they will be focusing on. For example, the millennials have a different buying pattern as compared to the boomers. So it really depends on the target audience. And the first and the most important trend that I've seen initially is that if you talk about fashion and apparel, that there have been a lot of people are not focusing on that right now, or were not focusing on it the past 6 months since they were at home. So they really didn't need to dress up. So they were not really interested in buying a lot of products. So there was a lot of interest in the food area and subscription services. For example, Netflix, Amazon Prime, you could talk about anything. A lot of people were getting that because they had limited activities at home. So these were the only things that they were focusing on. But I have also seen that ever since there has been a leniency in the lockdown, a lot of people also want to buy, they just want to buy everything now. Right. So like, as he said, Ibrahim said that he has seen an increase in his sales in the past 3 days. I think that's because people have now realized that they have the freedom. So now they'll just go on and buy things that they weren't even interested in buying previously. So I think that is something that companies can use, and they can use it in their marketing strategy, this certain time period, and knowing what their target audience is doing right now or how their buying behavior has moved in the past couple of months. I think that would be a big help for a lot of brands who are interested in changing their marketing strategy.
Right. Ibrahim, and of your specific product here, when you saw the lockdown being imposed, individuals not socializing as much as, of course, they should not be socializing during that time, did you feel like you had to change the way you approached your marketing and how you put your product on the market?
I would say we did think that we could sort of relate our brands to hygiene a bit. I read an article about increase in sales of men's grooming product all around the world. So during COVID, a lot of men, they started staying home, and in turn, when they're home, they're not going to their barbers. So what they do is they want to sort of groom themselves, groom their beard. So we didn't really have to do, shift a lot of our content or, start working on new sort of marketing strategies. But going to the question you asked before, that everyone's focusing on, e-commerce now. So how can brands differentiate? And also, being a startup, we also think that, we don't have the muscle, we don't have the resources to compete with big brands. So, everyone joining the e-commerce line, how can we sort of differentiate ourselves? What new marketing strategies do we need? So one thing we're going forward with is we're trying to create a brand personality. So we do a lot of content, we do a lot of videos, but everyone can sort of create those videos. Everyone sort of can create the product. But how we want to differentiate ourselves is by creating a brand personality that is unique to our image.
Right. Now, as you mentioned this, it's a very important point to pick up on startups and how engaging with e-commerce is, of course, much different than established brands. There is very little good, if any at all, that came out of this pandemic, but trying to talk about how it perhaps provided an opportunity for startups. Do you see it that way?
I would say it's sort of overall is good for the e-commerce ecosystem. Like, not a lot of people were paying attention to this ecosystem, even if you take big brands, for example. But the COVID time, you had no option but to do business online. So I won't say just startups, but the overall e-commerce industry has benefited a lot from COVID.
Right. Maheen, I just want to put one question to you. As you yourself stated, what is happening is unprecedented all across the world. In all of this, what would your advice be in regards to keeping marketing strategies flexible enough to deal with unforeseen circumstances?
Okay, so I think that it is very important that the marketing department and the supply chain departments work together. So during the pandemic, it was, you could say, it came as a shock to brand loyalty as per se, because a lot of people, because of supply chain disruption, a lot of people changed their preferred brands because they wouldn't wait for their favorite brand to manufacture a certain product. So it also opened a gateway for new startups who had recently started. Because of the supply chain disruption. Now they could cater to, they could use their good marketing strategies and they just put their brand out there. So I think that currently, I think that focusing on keeping your promise, whatever it is that you post on social media, you keep your promise as a brand, because even with bigger brands, if you're not keeping your promise, people can change their shopping behavior. They can change their brand. So it could be the whole pandemic came as a shock to the loyalty that people assumed that they had towards a certain brand. So I think that my message would be to just align your values, your brand values, with your consumers and with the kind of things that you post on social media. So I think that's the best thing the brands can do right now, because ultimately, consumers will move to a different brand if you're not keeping your promise.
Right. So you really drill on that fact that brands shouldn't take their loyalty for granted. And it's a very important point there. Thank you so much, Maheen, Ahmad, for joining us from Lahore. Ibrahim, Shaukat, for joining us from Lahore. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.